There's nothing quite like losing everything you've ever worked for to make you question whether life is worth living anymore. Jake Morrison had felt that emptiness every morning for 6 months. Ever since the bank took his family ranch, the same land his grandfather had built with his own hands. Most folks in Clearwater Creek figured Jake was finished, just another cowboy whose time had passed. But sometimes when you think you have nothing left, life gives you something worth saving. That September evening, when wildfire swept across the mesa, Jake spotted a black stallion trapped in the flames. He didn't think twice about risking his life to save the terrified horse. What Jake didn't know was that this one act of courage would put him up against the most powerful rancher in 3 counties. But would saving this stallion be enough to save Jake himself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The empty coffee cup sat on Jake Morrison's windowsill like it did every morning, stained brown from years of use and forgotten dreams. He stared at it now, watching the September dawn creep across the dusty street of Clearwater Creek, and wondered if his grandfather would be ashamed of what he'd become. The cup had been his ritual since Sarah dyed black coffee, no sugar, while he counted his regrets and planned another day of going through the motions. From his second-floor window at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Jake could see clear across Main Street to where the old barbershop used to be, before the drought killed half the businesses in town. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd gone from owning 1,500 acres of prime ranch land to renting a room barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. The Morrison spread had been in his family for 3 generations, built by his grandfathers. Calloused hands and sustained by his father's quiet determination. Now it belonged to First National Bank, and Jake belonged nowhere. The leather saddle hanging on the wall behind him told a different story than the broken man sitting by the window. Hand-tooled by his grandfather in 1952, it had carried 3 generations of Morrison men through roundups, rodeos, and the daily rhythm of ranch life. Sarah used to run her fingers along its worn edges and tell Jake it held the soul of his family. Now it gathered dust, a monument to everything he'd lost. Mrs. Henderson knocked softly on his door, the same gentle rap she'd used for the past 6 months. "Jake, honey, breakfast is getting cold." "Be right down, Mrs. H," he called back, though his voice carried no conviction. Eleanor Henderson had been his Sunday school teacher 30 years ago, and she treated him with the same patient kindness she'd shown when he was 8 years old and couldn't sit still through sermons. She'd offered him the room when the bank foreclosed, refusing to take his money for the first 3 months until his pride insisted on paying something. Jake pulled on his boots, worn Justin's that had seen better decades, and made his way downstairs to the kitchen that smelled of bacon grease and coffee. Mrs. Henderson bustled around the stove, her gray hair pinned back in the same style she'd worn since Eisenhower was president. At 73, she moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime taking care of others. "Scrambled eggs and toast," she announced, setting a plate in front of him. "And don't you dare tell me you're not hungry. A man your size needs proper nutrition." Jake managed a smile, the first genuine one in weeks. "Yes, ma'am." The eggs were perfect, the way Sarah used to make them, fluffy and seasoned just right. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing, while Mrs. Henderson refilled his coffee cup and studied him with the concerned expression she reserved for sick puppies and lost souls. "Doc Miller stopped by yesterday," she said casually, wiping down the already clean counter. "Says he could use some help at the clinic." Jake's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Doc Miller ran the only veterinary practice in 3 counties, and everyone knew he was getting too old to handle the heavy work alone. Before everything fell apart, Jake had been the man people called when they had trouble with horses. He'd had a gift for it. Sarah always said a way of understanding what animals needed before they knew it themselves. I appreciate the thought, Mrs. H, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Ready for what? Using the skills the good Lord gave you to help his creatures? Her tone was gentle but firm. Jake Morrison, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I've never seen you turn away from something that needed doing. That was the problem, Jake thought. He'd spent so much time doing what needed doing, working 18-hour days, taking out loans against the ranch, fighting the drought and the cattle prices and the weight of family expectations, that he'd forgotten how to do what he wanted to do. And now, sitting in this kitchen that wasn't his, eating breakfast paid for by someone else's charity, he wasn't sure he remembered who Jake Morrison used to be. The conversation was interrupted by Tommy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's 12-year-old grandson, bursting through the back door with the breathless excitement that only kids could maintain. His clothes were dusty, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were bright with the kind of news that couldn't wait. "Grandma, Mr. Morrison, you gotta come see this." Tommy practically bounced on his toes. "There's smoke coming from the mesa, and it's getting bigger." Mrs. Henderson moved to the window, her face creasing with worry. Jake followed his breakfast. Forgotten. In the distance, beyond the town limits where the prairie met the rocky outcrop of Cedar Mesa, a column of dark smoke rose against the morning sky like a prayer going the wrong direction. "That's moving fast," Jake muttered, his mind automatically calculating wind direction and fuel loads the way it had during his volunteer firefighting days. Probably started in the dry grass near Willow Creek. Within minutes, the volunteer fire siren began its mournful wail from the top of the fire station. Jake felt something stir in his chest, not quite purpose, but close to it. The muscle memory of crisis response, of being needed, of having skills that mattered. "I should go," he said, already reaching for his hat. Mrs. Henderson nodded, understanding. "Be careful, Jake. That mesa can be treacherous when the wind picks up." Tommy tugged at Jake's sleeve. "Can I come?" "I promise I'll stay out of the way. Not this time, son. But you can help your grandmother keep an eye on things from here." Jake headed for the door, then paused. For 6 months, he'd been a passenger. In his own life, letting circumstances carry him along like a leaf in a stream. But something about the smoke and the siren, and the familiar weight of his hat on his head, made him remember what it felt like to matter. The mesa was 15 minutes away by truck, assuming the old Ford started on the first try. As Jake climbed behind the wheel of Mrs. Henderson's pickup, his own had been repossessed. Along with everything else, he caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror. The man looking back had gray-streaked brown hair and lines around his blue eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. But for the first time in months, those eyes held something besides resignation. The truck started with a reluctant cough, and Jake pulled onto Main Street just as other volunteers were racing toward the mesa. He didn't know what he'd find out there, but he knew that sitting in that boarding house room, staring at that empty coffee cup, wasn't going to change anything. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for his life to get better and start making it better. The smoke was getting thicker as he drove, and Jake could see the orange glow of flames dancing across the horizon. Whatever was burning out there was big and getting bigger. He pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling something he hadn't felt in months, the urgency of being needed somewhere other than nowhere. The wildfire had already consumed 50 acres by the time Jake reached the mesa, and the September wind was pushing it toward the highway with the hungry determination of something alive. Volunteer firefighters worked desperately to create fire breaks, while county trucks sprayed water on the advancing flames, but Jake could see they were fighting a losing battle. The drought had turned the grassland into kindling, and nature had finally struck the match. He parked alongside the other vehicles and grabbed his old firefighting helmet from behind the seat. The familiar weight of it on his head brought back memories of other fires, other emergencies, when his hands had known exactly what to do. Chief Martinez spotted him immediately and waved him over to where the incident command was coordinating efforts. "Jake, thank God you're here. We need every experienced hand we can get." Chief Martinez had been fighting fires in this county for 20 years, and his weathered face showed the strain of watching his resources stretch too thin. The wind shifted 20 minutes ago, and now it's heading straight for the Clearwater subdivision. Jake nodded, already assessing the situation. The fire was moving in a classic V pattern, driven by winds that were picking up strength as the day heated up. Standard procedure would be to establish a defensive line and try to channel the fire toward the rocky areas where there was less fuel to burn. That's when he heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of flames and diesel engines like a knife. A horse's scream, high and desperate, coming from somewhere beyond the fire line. "Chief, you hear that?" Martinez paused, listening. The scream came again, wild with terror and pain. "Jesus, there's a horse out there." Jake was already moving, grabbing a water pack and ignoring the chief's shouts behind him. He'd grown up around horses, had trained them and doctored them, and loved them more than most people loved their children. No horse deserved to die alone and afraid, trapped by flames and smoke. The heat hit him like a physical blow as he crossed the fire line, and the smoke burned his lungs with every breath. His eyes streamed tears, but he kept moving toward the sound, using instincts honed by 30 years of reading the land and understanding how animals thought when they were scared. He found the stallion in a natural depression about 200 yards from the main fire, surrounded by a circle of burning grass that was closing in fast. The horse was magnificent pure black, except for a white star on his forehead, but he was trapped as surely as if he'd been locked in a cage. Every time he tried to break through the flames, the fire drove him back, and Jake could see burns along his flanks where he'd already tried to escape. The stallion's eyes rolled white with terror when he spotted Jake, and he reared up on his hind legs, striking at the air with hooves that could crush a man's skull. But Jake had handled frightened horses before, and he knew that beneath the panic was an animal that wanted to live. "Easy, boy," Jake called softly, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "Easy now. I'm here to help." He approached, slowly, hands visible, speaking in the calm, steady tone he'd learned from his father. The fire was getting closer, and he could feel the hair on his arms singeing from the heat. But rushing would only spook the horse further. The stallion's nostrils flared as he caught Jake's scent, and something in the man's presence seemed to penetrate his panic. Jake was close enough now to see the burns on the horse's coat, the rope halter that was half melted from the heat, and the intelligence in those dark eyes that recognized a potential savior. "That's right, big fellow. I know you're scared, but we're going to get out of this together." Jake pulled off his shirt and soaked it with water from his pack, then threw it over the stallion's head to protect his eyes and respiratory system. The horse flinched but didn't bolt, and Jake took that as permission to get closer. The singed rope halter was loose enough to slip over the stallion's ears, and Jake pocketed it without thinking. Then he was leading the horse through the narrowest part of the fire circle, both of them moving fast through flames that reached up to grab at their legs. The stallion stumbled once, favoring his left foreleg, but Jake kept him moving with gentle encouragement and steady pressure on the lead rope he'd fashioned from his belt. They burst through the flames together, both of them coughing and singed but alive. Behind them, the depression, where the stallion had been trapped, erupted in a column of fire that would have killed them. Both in another few minutes, Jake led the horse away from the flames, not stopping until they reached the road where the emergency vehicles were parked. Only then did he allow himself to examine the stallion's injuries, burns along his flanks and legs that would need immediate attention, possible smoke inhalation, and a limp that suggested a stone bruise or worse. "My God, Jake, what were you thinking?" Chief Martinez appeared at his elbow, equal parts angry and amazed. "You could have been killed out there." Jake looked up from examining the stallion's injured leg. Couldn't leave him to burn, Chief. Wouldn't be right. That's when Doc Miller arrived, his veterinary truck loaded with supplies for treating injured livestock. The old veterinarian took one look at the stallion and let out a low whistle. Beautiful animal. Quarter horse, I guess, with some Arabian bloodline. Doc Miller approached the horse with the same careful respect Jake had shown. These burns need immediate attention, but he should recover fully with proper care. As Doc Miller began treating the stallion's injuries, Jake found himself studying the animal more closely. This wasn't some ranch horse that had wandered off. The stallion was too well built, too valuable, to be running loose on the mesa. Someone was missing a prize animal, and Jake wondered how long it had been out there before the fire trapped it. The singed rope halter in his pocket felt heavier than it should have, and when Jake examined it more closely, he could make out partial brand mark burned into the leather. The letters were hard to read, but they looked like they might spell Blackwood. Doc, you ever heard of anyone named Blackwood around these parts? Doc Miller paused in his examination of the stallions. Burns, Theodore Blackwood, owns the biggest spread in 3 counties, about 40 miles north of here. Mean as a snake and twice as dangerous. The veterinarian's expression darkened. Why do you ask? Jake showed him the halter, pointing out the faded letters. Found this on the stallion. Looks like it might have his brand. Well, that's a problem, Doc Miller said quietly. Theodore Blackwood isn't the kind of man who takes kindly to losing his property, even temporarily. But as Jake looked at the stallion standing quietly now, accepting Doc Miller's treatment with the dignity of an animal that had been saved from certain death, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. For the first time since losing the ranch, he had something that needed him, something that depended on his skills and his care. The stallion turned his head toward Jake, and their eyes met across the space between species. In that moment, Jake knew that saving this horse had somehow saved something in himself. He also knew that Theodore Blackwood, whoever he was, would have to go through Jake Morrison to get his stallion back. Doc, can you take him back to your clinic? I'll cover the expenses. Doc Miller studied Jake's face, reading something there that made him nod slowly. Course I can. But Jake, if this horse belongs to Blackwood, you might be buying yourself more trouble than you can handle. Jake reached out and gently touched the stallion's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the singed coat. Maybe trouble is exactly what I need right now, Doc. Maybe trouble is what's going to make me feel alive again. Sarah's medical kit sat unopened in the bottom of Jake's dresser drawer, wrapped in the same blue bandana she'd used to tie back her hair when she worked in their garden. He hadn't touched it since the funeral 18 months ago, but now he found himself carefully unpacking the supplies she'd accumulated during their 22 years of marriage: antiseptic, gauze, medical tape, and the bottle of hydrogen peroxide she'd sworn by for cleaning wounds. You always said these would come in handy someday, Jake murmured to the empty room, his voice thick with memories at Doc Miller's clinic. The stallion stood patiently in the largest stall while Jake cleaned the burns that striped his flanks. Like lightning bolts frozen in black flesh, the horse flinched at first contact but quickly settled, seeming to understand that the gentle hands working over his injuries meant healing, not harm. Easy, boy, Jake whispered, the same way he talked to nervous colts when he was still in the horse training business. Sarah always said I had a gift with animals. Guess we're about to find out if she was right. Doc Miller watched from the doorway, occasionally offering advice, but mostly observing the way Jake worked with natural confidence around the injured stallion. Haven't seen anyone handle horses like that since your daddy, the old veterinarian commented. It's like you're speaking their language. Jake's hands moved with muscle memory older than conscious thought, applying salve to the burns with the same care Sarah had used when she doctored injured calves on the ranch. The stallion's dark eyes followed his every movement, and Jake could swear He saw gratitude in that intelligent gaze. "What do you think he was doing out there on the mesa?" Jake asked, running his fingers along the horse's neck to check for other injuries. Hard to say. Could have been running loose for days, maybe weeks. Wild horses sometimes come down from the high country when water gets scarce. Doc Miller approached the stall slowly, respecting the stallion's space. But this one's been handled by humans. Look at the way he stands for grooming. That's not natural behavior. By the third day, word had spread through Clearwater Creek about the cowboy who'd risked his life to save a horse from the wildfire. People started stopping by Doc Miller's clinic just to get a look at the stallion, and Jake found himself answering the same questions over and over. How close were the flames? Wasn't he scared? What made him do such a crazy thing? The attention made him uncomfortable, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction of doing something that mattered, something that required the skills he'd spent a lifetime developing. For the first time since losing the ranch, he woke up each morning with a purpose that went beyond just getting through another day. Tommy Henderson appeared at the clinic every afternoon after school, drawn by the same fascination with horses that had consumed Jake at that age. The boy would stand by the stall for hours, asking endless questions about horse behavior and training techniques. "Why does he like you so much, Mr. Morrison?" Tommy asked, watching Jake brush the stallion's coat with long, smooth strokes. "Animals know when someone cares about them," Jake explained, working around the healing burns with careful precision. "Your grandmother's the same way with people. They sense her kindness before she even speaks." The stallion had begun nickering. Whenever Jake appeared, turning his head toward the sound of familiar footsteps and showing the kind of attachment that usually took months to develop. It was like the shared experience of surviving the fire had created an instant bond between man and horse. "He needs a name," Tommy announced one afternoon, watching the stallion prance around the small paddock behind the clinic. Jake paused in his brushing. He'd been thinking the same thing, but hadn't wanted to presume ownership of an animal that obviously belonged to someone else. Still, calling him the stallion felt cold and impersonal. "What do you think we should call him?" Tommy considered this with the seriousness of a 12-year-old making an important decision. "Phoenix," he said finally. "Like the bird that rises from the ashes. Because you saved him from the fire. Phoenix." Jake tested the name in his mind and found it fit. The stallion had emerged from flames that should have killed him, reborn through courage and chance into something magnificent. "Phoenix it is," Jake agreed, and the horse's ears pricked forward as if he approved of his new identity. The healing process became Jake's daily rhythm. Every morning, he'd walk from Mrs. Henderson's boarding house to the clinic, where Phoenix would greet him with a soft whicker of recognition. They developed routines. Phoenix would lower his head for the halter without being asked, stand perfectly still during treatments, and follow Jake around the paddock like an oversized dog. Sarah's medical supplies were proving invaluable for the more delicate aspects of wound care. Her gentle touch seemed to flow through Jake's hands as he changed bandages and applied fresh medication. And he found himself talking to Phoenix the way he used to talk to Sarah when she was working in her garden. "She would have loved you," he told the stallion one evening as the sun painted the clinic walls gold. "Sarah always said horses were God's way of showing us what grace looked like with 4 legs and a mane." Doc Miller had been watching this transformation with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize healing when he saw it. Jake Morrison was becoming himself again, and the horse was recovering faster than medical science suggested was possible. "That animal is going to be worth a small fortune once he's fully healed," Doc Miller mentioned casually while Jake worked on Phoenix's evening grooming. "Horses like that don't come along often." Jake's hands stilled on the brush. He'd been so focused on nursing Phoenix back to health that he'd almost forgotten the stallion belonged to someone else. Theodore and Blackwood according to the burned halter still sitting in his dresser drawer. I know he's not mine, Doc, but until his owner comes looking, I'm responsible for his care. And what if his owner never comes looking? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from an old fire. Jake had been avoiding that possibility, afraid to hope for something that seemed too good to be true. But as he looked at Phoenix strong, healthy, and utterly devoted to the man who'd saved his life, he allowed himself to wonder what it would be like to have a horse like this permanently. Phoenix nudged Jake's shoulder with his velvet muzzle, a gesture of affection that had become their nightly ritual. In that touch, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, the pure, uncomplicated love of a creature who asked nothing more than food, shelter, and gentle hands. Then I guess we'd have to figure out what comes next, Jake said quietly, running his hand along Phoenix's neck. That's a bridge we'll cross when we come to it. The newspaper clipping had been yellowed with age when Doc Miller pulled it from his desk drawer. The headline barely legible: Rancher accused of animal cruelty investigation ongoing. The article was 3 years old, and the accompanying photograph showed a man with cold eyes and an expensive hat standing next to a horse trailer. Theodore Blackwood, the caption read, denying allegations of mistreatment at his Lazy Bee Ranch. Found. This when you mentioned the name, Doc Miller said quietly, handing Jake the clipping. Thought you should know what kind of man might come looking for that stallion. Jake studied the photograph, noting the way Blackwood's hand gripped a riding crop and the defensive posture of the horses visible behind him. There was something in the man's expression that spoke of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted, without asking permission. Charges were dropped, Doc Miller continued, but word around the veterinary community was that he had connections in the sheriff's department. Money has a way of making problems disappear around here. Before Jake could respond, the clinic door opened with enough force to rattle the windows. 3 men entered without knocking, 2 ranch hands in dusty work clothes flanking. A third man, whose expensive boots and tailored shirt marked him as someone used to giving orders instead of taking them. Theodore Blackwood was taller than his newspaper photograph suggested, with silver hair and the kind of presence that filled a room like smoke from a dangerous fire. His pale eyes swept the clinic with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property, and when they settled on Jake, they held no warmth whatsoever. I'm looking for my horse, Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. Black Stallion, about 16 hands, worth more than this entire clinic. I believe you pulled him out of that fire on the mesa. Doc Miller stepped forward, professional courtesy warring with obvious discomfort. Mr. Blackwood, the stallion is healing nicely, but he's not ready for transport yet. The burns need another week or 2 before. I'll decide when my property is ready for transport, Blackwood interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Where is he? Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he kept his voice level. The horse is recovering from serious injuries. Moving him too soon could cause permanent damage. Blackwood's attention focused on Jake like a hawk spotting prey. And you are? Jake Morrison. I'm the one who found him in the fire. Well, Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your heroic gesture, but the animal belongs to me. I have papers proving ownership, and I want him loaded and ready to go within the hour. The casual dismissal in Blackwood's voice struck Jake like a physical blow. 3 weeks of careful nursing, of watching Phoenix's trust develop day by day, reduced to a heroic gesture that had served its purpose. He's not ready, Jake repeated, his voice harder now. Those burns are still healing, and the stress of transport could what? Blackwood stepped closer, and Jake caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else. The kind of anger that came from being told no by people he considered beneath him. Cost me money? That horse is worth $50,000 on the breeding market, and every day he spends in this backwater clinic is money out of my pocket. $50,000. Jake tried to hide his shock at the number, but something in his expression must have shown because Blackwood smiled, a cold expression that never touched his eyes. Didn't realize what you rescued, did you? That stallion has bloodlines that go back to Secretariat. He's the foundation sire for my breeding program, and he's been missing for 2 weeks. Missing? Doc Miller interjected. How does a horse worth $50,000 just go missing? Blackwood's smile vanished. That's not your concern. What concerns you is that I want my property back, and I want it now. Jake looked toward the paddock where Phoenix stood in a patch of afternoon sunlight, his coat gleaming black as midnight except for the white star on his forehead. The stallion's head was raised, ears pricked forward in alertness, and even at this distance, Jake could see the tension in his posture. Animals always knew when predators were near. Let me see your papers, Jake said quietly. Blackwood nodded to one of his men, who produced a folder thick with official-looking documents. Bill of sale, registration papers, breeding records, all bearing Phoenix's description and Blackwood's. Name his owner. Satisfied? Blackwood asked, his tone suggesting that Jake's satisfaction was irrelevant. Jake studied the papers, looking for anything that might give him grounds to delay the inevitable. The documentation appeared legitimate, but something about the dates bothered him. According to the breeding records, Phoenix had been continuously at Blackwood's ranch for the past 3 years, which didn't explain how he'd ended up running loose on the mesa. These papers show him at your ranch last month, Jake observed. How did he end up 40 miles away in a wildfire? Blackwood's expression darkened. Horses get out. Fences break. These things happen. But Phoenix nickered from the paddock, a sound Jake had learned to interpret as distress. The stallion was moving restlessly now, his tail swishing with agitation, as if he could sense the tension radiating from the clinic. I need to see him first, Blackwood announced, already moving toward the paddock. Make sure he's in acceptable condition. Jake's blood ran cold as he followed Blackwood outside. Phoenix had retreated to the far corner of the paddock, his body language screaming fear, in ways that had nothing to do with his injuries. When Blackwood approached the fence, the stallion's nostrils flared and he backed against the rails, trembling. Easy, boy, Blackwood called, but his voice carried none of the gentleness Jake had learned to use. It was the tone of someone speaking to property, not a living creature. Phoenix's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He reared back on his hind legs, striking at the air with hooves that could crush bone, his eyes rolling white with terror. This wasn't the behavior of a horse greeting his owner. It was the response of an animal confronted by something that had hurt him before. Seems like he remembers you, Jake said quietly, stepping between Blackwood and the paddock fence. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. That horse has always been high-strung. He'll settle down once he's back in familiar surroundings. Or maybe he's trying to tell us something. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jake could feel the temperature drop several degrees as Blackwood's cold gaze fixed on him. This was a man accustomed to having his word accepted without question, and Jake's implied doubt was clearly not welcome. Mr. Morrison, Blackwood said slowly, I'm going to assume you're speaking from ignorance, rather than malice. That horse belongs to me, and he's leaving with me today. The only question is whether you can make this easy or difficult. Jake looked at Phoenix, still trembling against the far fence, and thought about courage. Not the kind of courage that runs into burning buildings or charges in the battle, but the quieter kind that stands up to bullies even when the odds are stacked against you. Doc Miller's right, Jake said finally. The horse isn't ready for transport. Medical opinion trumps ownership papers when it comes to animal welfare. Blackwood's smile was sharp as broken glass. Is that your final word? It is. Then you've made this difficult, Mr. Morrison. and I promise you'll regret that choice. Jake's father had given him the silver horseshoe on his 16th birthday, a tarnished piece of metal that had belonged to Thunder, the gelding who taught 3 generations of Morrison men to ride. "Carry this when you need luck," his father had said, "but remember that luck is just preparation meeting opportunity." Now Jake rolled the horseshoe between his fingers as he sat in Lawyer Samuel Garrett's office, listening to legal advice that sounded like a death sentence delivered in gentle tones. "I understand your attachment to the animal, Jake, but the law is clear on this matter," Garrett explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Theodore Blackwood has legitimate ownership papers, and you have no legal standing to prevent him from reclaiming his property." The legal papers Blackwood's attorney had served that morning lay spread across Garrett's desk like accusations: demand for immediate return of stolen property, threat of civil lawsuit for unlawful detention, warning of criminal charges if Jake continued to interfere with Blackwood's rights as the legal owner. What if the horse was stolen in the first place? Jake asked, grasping for any argument that might delay the inevitable. Phoenix's reaction to Blackwood wasn't normal. Animals don't fear their owners like that unless there's been abuse. Garrett's expression softened with sympathy. Proving abuse would require veterinary evidence, witness testimony, and a formal investigation. That could take months, and in the meantime, you'd be in violation of a court order. Jake felt the horseshoe's smooth edges bite into his palm as his grip tightened. Outside Garrett's window, he could see the clinic where Phoenix waited, unaware that his days of safety were numbered. "How long do I have?" "The order gives you 48 hours to comply. After that, Sheriff Davidson will be legally obligated to seize the horse and return it to Blackwood. 48 hours. Jake thought about everything that could be accomplished in that time. Phoenix's burns could heal a little more. Maybe enough to handle transport without permanent damage. Or maybe Jake could find some legal loophole, some technicality that would give them more time. "There is one thing," Garrett said slowly, as if testing the words before speaking them. "The ownership papers show some irregularities in the dates. Nothing that would hold up in court, but it might be worth investigating how Blackwood acquired the horse in the first place." Back at the clinic, Jake found Phoenix pacing restlessly in his stall, as if the stallion could sense the approaching storm. The horse's dark eyes tracked Jake's movement with an intelligence that seemed almost human, and when Jake entered the stall, Phoenix immediately moved to his side, seeking comfort in the familiar presence. "I know, boy," Jake murmured, running his hand along Phoenix's neck. "I can feel it, too." Doc Miller appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. "Any luck with the lawyer?" "About what you'd expect. Blackwood has the law on his side, and I've got 48 hours to hand Phoenix over or face criminal charges. And then what? You just walk away and pretend none of this happened?" Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he began grooming Phoenix with long, methodical strokes, the routine calming both man and horse. The stallion's coat had regained its lustrous shine, and the burns were healing better than Doc Miller had dared hope. In another week, Phoenix would be completely recovered, strong enough to survive whatever Blackwood had planned for him. "Maybe that's what I should do," Jake said finally. "Walk away. I've got no money for a legal fight, no political connections, nothing but a stubborn shriek that's already cost me everything I ever owned." But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew he couldn't follow through. Phoenix had given him back something he'd thought was lost forever: purpose, hope, the feeling of being needed by something that depended on his strength and skill. Walking away would be like abandoning himself all over again. Tommy Henderson arrived for his usual after-school visit, bursting through the clinic door with his backpack still slung over his shoulder. The boy's face fell when he saw Jake's expression. "What's wrong, Mr. Morrison? You look like somebody died." Jake glanced at Doc Miller, who nodded slightly. The boy deserved to know the truth, even if it was painful. Phoenix's owner came looking for him today, Tommy, a man named Theodore Blackwood. He has legal papers proving the horse belongs to him. Tommy's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. But Phoenix doesn't want to go with him. Any fool can see that. Can't you just tell the man no? I tried that. Now I've got 48 hours to turn Phoenix over, or the sheriff will come and take him by force. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information with the serious expression of someone older than his 12 years. Then he walked over to Phoenix's stall and pressed his face against the bars, studying the stallion with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. My dad used to say that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the wrong law, Tommy said, quietly. He said that during World War II, people who hid Jewish families were breaking the law, but they were still heroes. Jake felt something twist in his chest at the boy's simple wisdom. It's not that simple, son. This isn't about hiding people from Nazis. It's about a legal dispute over ownership of a horse. Is it? Tommy turned to face Jake, his young eyes blazing with conviction. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to protect Phoenix from someone who wants to hurt him. And that seems pretty simple to me. That evening, Jake sat in his room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, staring at his father's silver horseshoe and thinking about courage. The horseshoe had been with him through rodeos and roundups, through his wedding day and Sarah's funeral, through the long, dark months after losing the ranch. It had never brought him luck in the traditional sense, but it had reminded him of who he was supposed to be, a Morrison, raised to stand up for what was right, even when the cost was high. Mrs. Henderson knocked softly on his door, then entered with a cup of coffee and the kind of determined expression that had once faced down school board meetings and church committees. I heard about your troubles, she said, setting the coffee on his nightstand. Word travels fast in a town this size. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. Mrs. H. If Blackwood decides to make things difficult for people who've helped me, Theodore Blackwood can kiss my behind. Mrs. Henderson interrupted with surprising vehemence. I've been dealing with bullies longer than that man's been alive, and I didn't survive the Great Depression and raise 5 children by backing down from fights that mattered. Jake looked up at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. That horse chose you, Jake Morrison. Anyone with eyes can see it. And you chose him right back when you risked your life to pull him out of that fire. Some bonds don't have anything to do with legal papers. The law doesn't see it that way. The law has been wrong before. Mrs. Henderson settled into the room's only chair, her expression softening slightly. I watched you waste away in this room for 6 months, like a plant trying to grow without sunlight. Then you saved that stallion, and suddenly you were Jake Morrison again, the man who'd give his last dollar to help a neighbor, who'd work 20-hour days to save the ranch his grandfather built. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. That horse didn't just save your life by giving you purpose. You saved his life by showing him what kindness looked like. Don't let Theodore Blackwood destroy something that beautiful just because he has better lawyers. After Mrs. Henderson left, Jake walked to the window and looked out at the lights of Clearwater Creek. Somewhere out there, Phoenix was settling in for the night, trusting that the man who'd saved him from the fire would continue to keep him safe. The stallion didn't understand legal papers or court orders. He only knew that Jake Morrison meant safety, healing, and gentle hands. Jake closed his fingers around the silver horseshoe, feeling its familiar weight. His father had been, right luck was preparation meeting opportunity. And maybe, just maybe, Jake's preparation was about to meet the opportunity to prove that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. The bundle of unpaid bills arrived at Peterson's feed store on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by one of Blackwood's ranch hands with instructions that were clear as crystal. Any business that continued serving Jake Morrison would find their credit lines called in immediately. Within hours, similar visits had been made to the hardware store, the gas station, and every other business that might have dealings with a man trying to care for a valuable horse. "I'm sorry, Jake," Bill Peterson said, his weathered hands shaking as he spoke. "You know I'd help if I could. The Blackwood hold the paper on my store loan. If he calls it in, I'll lose everything." Jake stood in the feed store that had served his family for 3 generations, surrounded by the smells of oats and molasses that reminded him of better times. The sack of horse feed in his hands felt heavier than it should have, weighed down by the knowledge that it might be the last one he'd be able to buy in Clearwater Creek. "I understand, Bill. A man's got to look after his own family first, but understanding didn't make it hurt less." By noon, Jake had been turned away from 4 businesses, each owner offering the same apologetic explanation. Blackwood's reach was too long, his influence too deep, for anyone to risk crossing him over a horse dispute. At the clinic, Phoenix seemed to sense the growing tension. The Stallion had developed the habit of positioning himself where he could watch both the road and the clinic entrance, his ears constantly swiveling toward any sound that might signal approaching trouble. When Jake entered the paddock that afternoon, Phoenix immediately moved to his side, pressing his massive head against Jake's chest in a gesture of comfort that worked both ways. "You know something's wrong, don't you, boy?" Jake murmured, scratching behind Phoenix's ears. Horses always were smarter than people gave them credit for. Doc Miller emerged from the clinic with a grim expression and a piece of paper that looked official enough to be bad news. "Sheriff Davidson stopped by while you were in town. Blackwood's lawyer filed an injunction. If Phoenix isn't returned by tomorrow evening, they're authorized to seize him." Jake read the legal document twice, the formal language doing nothing to soften its impact. Tomorrow evening. Less than 30 hours to figure out a miracle or watch Phoenix disappear into Blackwood's trailer. "There's something else," Doc Miller continued. "I called my colleague up in Billings, the one who's been doing equine forensics work. He says there have been rumors about Blackwood's operation for years, horses disappearing from other ranches, breeding records that don't match up, registration papers that appear legitimate but can't be verified. Rumors don't hold up in court. No, but they might point us towards someone who has real evidence. Problem is, most folks are too scared of Blackwood to talk." That evening, Jake decided to demonstrate Phoenix's training progress to the small crowd that had gathered at the clinic. Word had spread through town about the impending seizure, and people came to see what they might never see again, a broken down Cowboy and a magnificent Stallion who'd found each other in a moment of shared desperation. Jake led Phoenix into the paddock as the sun painted the western sky gold and orange. Without a saddle or bridle, using only subtle shifts in weight and gentle voice commands, he guided the Stallion through a series of movements that showcased their extraordinary bond. Phoenix responded to Jake's slightest gesture, moving with the fluid grace of a dancer interpreting music only he could hear. They were communicating in a language older than words, built on trust and mutual respect rather than force or intimidation. "My God," breathed Martha Collins, the town librarian. "I've never seen anything like that." Tommy Henderson sat on the fence rail, his eyes wide with wonder as Jake and Phoenix moved together like they were sharing the same thoughts. "It's like they're talking to each other without words." But the demonstration that was meant to show Phoenix's value only emphasized what everyone already knew. This wasn't just about ownership papers or legal technicalities. This was about the destruction of something rare and beautiful by someone who saw living creatures as commodities to be bought and sold. As the crowd dispersed, Jake noticed several people avoiding eye contact, their expressions carrying the weight of guilt and helplessness. These were good people, neighbors who'd known his family for generations. The Blackwood's economic stranglehold on the county made open support too dangerous. Mrs. Henderson was one of the last to leave, and she approached Jake with the determined look that usually preceded her most direct observations. "Half this town is ashamed of themselves tonight," she announced. "They know what's right, but they're too scared to stand up for it. Can't blame them for protecting their livelihoods. Mrs. H. Blackwood's got the power to destroy anyone who crosses him. Power he's had too long without anyone challenging it." Mrs. Henderson's jaw was set in the stubborn line Jake remembered from his childhood Sunday school classes. Sometimes it takes one person standing up to a bully to remind everyone else that bullies can be beaten. After everyone had gone home, Jake remained in the paddock with Phoenix, both of them reluctant to end what might be their last evening together. The Stallion seemed to understand that something significant was approaching. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by a restless energy that spoke of intelligence grappling with circumstances beyond its control. "I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, boy," Jake said quietly, his hand resting on Phoenix's neck. "But I want you to know that these past few weeks have meant everything to me. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." Phoenix nickered softly and turned his head to look directly at Jake, their eyes meeting in the fading twilight. In that moment, Jake felt a connection that transcended species, an understanding that some bonds were stronger than legal documents or economic pressure. As he walked back to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Jake's mind was already working on possibilities, alternatives, and desperate measures. Tomorrow evening, Blackwood would come for Phoenix, backed by the full authority of the law and confident in his ability to crush anyone who stood in his way. But Jake Morrison had learned something important during these weeks of caring for an injured stallion. Sometimes the most valuable things in life were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. And sometimes, if you were prepared and brave enough to seize the opportunity, even hopeless fights could be won. The hidden brand revealed itself during what Jake thought would be his final grooming session with Phoenix. He'd been working methodically through the stallion's coat, saying goodbye in the only way he knew how, when his brush caught on a section of hair that felt different from the rest. Thicker, coarser, as if it had grown over scar tissue. Jake parted the hair carefully and froze. There, barely visible beneath Phoenix's midnight coat, was the faint outline of an older brand, not Blackwood's distinctive B, but something else entirely. The original mark had been deliberately obscured, burned over with a running iron to create scar tissue that would hide the true ownership mark. "Doc," Jake called, his voice tight with excitement. "You need to see this." Doc Miller hurried over, took one look at Jake's discovery, and let out a low whistle. "Someone's been doing some creative metalwork on this horse. That's not natural scarring. That's been done deliberately to hide the original brand." Working together, they carefully shaved away the hair around the hidden mark, revealing letters that had been burned over but not completely destroyed. C, surrounded by a circular rope design. It was the kind of distinctive brand that would be recorded in livestock registries across the western states. "CS Ranch," Doc Miller mused. "That design looks familiar, but I can't place it." Jake was already moving toward the clinic's computer, his fingers fumbling with the keyboard as he searched livestock registration databases. The brand registry for Montana came up first, showing dozens of variations on rope designs, but none matching Phoenix's hidden mark. "Try Colorado," Doc Miller suggested. That style of branding iron was popular down south. The Colorado Registry loaded slowly, page after page of registered brands from ranches across the state. Jake was beginning to lose hope when he found it. CS Ranch, Clearwater County, Colorado. Owned by Maria Santos, specializing in quarter horse breeding with Arabian bloodlines. The registration photo made Jake's heart skip. There was Phoenix, 3 years younger, but unmistakably the same horse, standing beside a small, dark-haired woman whose smile radiated genuine love for the animal beside her. "Santa's Ranch," Jake read aloud. "Phoenix registered name Clearwater Storm, stolen from the property in August 2021. Reward offered for information leading to recovery. Doc Miller leaned over Jake's shoulder, reading the details of the theft. Report: truck and trailer, middle of the night, professional job. They took 3 horses, but this one was the prize of the breeding program. Jake scrolled down to find Maria Santos' contact information, his hands shaking with the implications of what they'd discovered. Blackwood wasn't Phoenix's legitimate owner. He was the thief, or at least the final buyer in a chain of horse theft that stretched across state lines. This changes everything, Jake breathed. More than you know, Doc Miller said grimly. If Blackwood's been running stolen horses through his breeding program, using forged papers to establish false ownership, we're talking about a felony operation worth millions of dollars. Jake reached for the phone, then stopped. What if she doesn't want him back? What if she's given up hope after 3 years? Only one way to find out. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, speaking English with a slight Spanish accent. Santos Ranch, Maria speaking. Mrs. Santos, my name is Jake Morrison, and I'm calling from Montana. I believe I found your stolen stallion. Clearwater storm. The silence that followed stretched so long that Jake wondered if the connection had been lost. Then he heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by words that came out in a rush of hope and disbelief. Storm? You found my Storm? Is he all right? I never stopped looking, but after 3 years, he's healthy, ma'am. Been through some rough times, but he's healing well. The problem is, the man who's been holding him has legal papers, claiming ownership, and he's threatening to take Phoenix Storm back tomorrow. Theodore Blackwood, Maria said, her voice turning cold. I know that name. The FBI has been investigating him for 2 years, but they can never get enough evidence to make charges stick. He's careful, and he has connections in law enforcement. Jake felt his heart sink. If the FBI couldn't touch Blackwood, what chance did a washed-up cowboy from Montana have? But you said you found the original brand, Maria continued. That's evidence, real evidence. If you can prove the horse was stolen, Blackwood's ownership papers become worthless. The brand was burned over, hidden under new scar tissue. Smart. Thieves do that to valuable horses. Makes them harder to identify, but the original brand is usually still visible to someone who knows how to look. Maria's voice was gaining strength, hope replacing despair. Mr. Morrison, I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to give you the number for FBI agent Patricia Reeves. She's been working the Blackwood case, and she's been waiting for exactly this kind of break. Jake scribbled down the number, his mind racing with possibilities. Mrs. Santos, there's something else you should know. Storm Phoenix, he's formed a strong bond with me. Saving him from a wildfire, nursing him back to health, we've gotten pretty attached to each other. Another silence, this one filled with a different kind of weight. Mr. Morrison, Storm was my husband's horse. Carlos died in a car accident 6 months before Storm was stolen, and losing that stallion felt like losing Carlos all over again. I dreamed of getting him back, but her voice broke, and Jake could hear her crying softly. But Carlos always said that horses choose their people as much as people choose their horses. If Storm has chosen you, if you've cared for him and loved him when I couldn't be there, then maybe that's exactly what was supposed to happen. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. This woman had spent 3 years searching for her stolen horse, never giving up hope, and now she was willing to consider what was best for Phoenix rather than just reclaiming her property. Let's focus on stopping Blackwood first, Jake said. Then we can figure out what comes next for Phoenix for Storm. Agreed. But Mr. Morrison? Thank you for saving him. Thank you for giving him the love and care he deserved when I couldn't be there to do it myself. After ending the call, Jake immediately dialed Agent Reeves' number. The FBI agent answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. Agent Reeves, Agent Reeves, my name is Jake Morrison. Maria Santos gave me your number. I believe I have evidence in the Theodore Blackwood case. What kind of evidence, Mr. Morrison? A stolen horse with a hidden brand, forged ownership papers, and about 24 hours before Blackwood's lawyers forced me to turn the animal over to him. I can be in Clearwater Creek by morning, Agent Reeves said without hesitation. Don't let that horse out of your sight until I get there. Jake hung up the phone and looked at Phoenix, who had been watching the entire conversation with the intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Looks like we're not done fighting yet, boy, Jake said, running his hand along the stallion's neck. But this time, we've got the law on our side. Jake retrieved his father's Winchester rifle from the storage unit at dawn, the familiar weight of the weapon bringing back memories of hunting trips and lessons about responsibility that seemed a lifetime ago. The rifle hadn't been fired in 2 years, not since he'd locked it away after losing the ranch. But muscle memory guided his hands as he cleaned and loaded it with the methodical precision his father had taught him. I'm not looking for trouble, Jake told Doc Miller as he secured the Winchester in the clinic's gun rack. But if Blackwood decides to take Phoenix by force before Agent Reeves gets here, I want to be prepared. Doc Miller nodded grimly. FBI or no FBI, men like Blackwood don't give up their secrets easily. He spent 3 years building a criminal enterprise around stolen horses, and he won't let one discovery bring it all down. Agent Patricia Reeves arrived at the clinic just after sunrise, a compact woman in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of sharp eyes that miss nothing. She examined Phoenix's hidden brand with the thoroughness of someone who'd built careers on physical evidence, photographing it from every angle and taking measurements that would stand up in federal court. This is exactly what we needed, she told Jake as she documented the concealed brand. We've known Blackwood was running stolen horses through his breeding program, but we could never prove it. This stallion is the missing link that connects him to Maria Santos' theft and at least 6 other cases across 4 states. Jake watched her work, impressed by her efficiency, but troubled by the implications of what she was saying. How many horses are we talking about? Blackwood's operation has moved approximately 40 stolen horses over the past 5 years, using forged papers to legitimize their sale to unsuspecting buyers. Total estimated value is somewhere around $2 million. $2 million. Jake thought about the magnitude of the criminal enterprise that had been operating in his backyard, and about how many families like Maria Santos had lost their beloved animals to Blackwood's greed. What happens now? Doc Miller asked. Now we set a trap, Agent Reeves replied. Blackwood doesn't know we've discovered the hidden brand, which means he'll proceed with his plan to reclaim the horse. When he shows up with his forged papers, we'll have him on federal charges of interstate horse theft, fraud, and racketeering. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jake would appear to comply with the court order, bringing Phoenix to the designated meeting point at the clinic. Blackwood would arrive with his men and his fraudulent paperwork, expecting to load the stallion and disappear before anyone could interfere. Instead, he'd find FBI agents waiting with arrest warrants and enough evidence to dismantle his entire operation. The risk, Agent Reeves explained, is that Blackwood might become violent when he realizes he's been caught. Men with this much to lose sometimes make desperate choices. Jake nodded, understanding the stakes. Phoenix stays with me until the very end. If shooting starts, I want to be between him and any danger. Agent Reeves studied Jake's face, reading the determination there. Mr. Morrison, you've already done more than anyone had a right to ask. If you want to step aside and let federal agents handle this. No. Jake's voice was firm. Phoenix and I have been through too much together for me to abandon him now. Besides, he trusts me. If things go sideways, I'm the only one who can keep him calm. The waiting was the hardest part. Jake spent the morning grooming Phoenix, talking to him in the gentle tones that had become their private language, trying to prepare the stallion for whatever was coming without transmitting his own anxiety. Phoenix seemed to sense the approaching confrontation, his ears constantly swiveling toward sounds that might signal danger. Tommy Henderson arrived at the clinic during lunch, his face pale with worry and determination. "Mr. Morrison, I want to help. This isn't a place for kids, Tommy. Your grandmother would skin me alive if anything happened to you." "But Phoenix is my friend too," Tommy protested. "I've been coming here every day, helping take care of him. I can't just hide at home while you face Blackwood alone." Jake looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw something of his younger self in Tommy's stubborn courage. This wasn't about childish adventure. It was about loyalty to something that mattered. "All right," Jake said finally. "But you stay with Doc Miller while away from the action. Your job is to be our communications backup. If something goes wrong, you call Sheriff Davidson and tell him we need help." Mrs. Henderson appeared at the clinic door, carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and determination. "Don't even think about sending me away, Jake Morrison. I've been part of this story since the beginning, and I intend to see how it ends. Mrs. H, this could get dangerous. So could crossing the street, but that doesn't stop me from going to the grocery store." She set the basket down and fixed Jake with the look that had intimidated 3 generations of misbehaving children. "That horse chose you, and you chose him. Some of us understand what that means, even if Theodore Blackwood doesn't." By mid-afternoon, word had somehow spread through Clearwater Creek that something significant was happening at the veterinary clinic. People began arriving in small groups: ranchers, shop owners, retired teachers, mechanics, until nearly 50. Townspeople had gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. Jake was amazed by the show of support, but also worried about civilian safety if the confrontation turned violent. Agent Reeves shared his concern, positioning her agents strategically around the clinic while keeping the crowd at a safe distance. "They know the risks," she told Jake, "but they also know that sometimes good people have to stand up to bullies, regardless of the danger." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the clinic grounds, Jake led Phoenix out of his stall for what might be their final walk together. The stallion moved with fluid grace, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the afternoon light. The hidden brand beneath his coat told a story of crime and cruelty, but Phoenix himself was a testament to something else entirely: the power of love and patient care to heal even the deepest wounds. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Jake knew that his time with this magnificent animal had changed him in ways that would last the rest of his life. "Ready, boy?" Jake whispered, his hand resting on Phoenix's neck. Phoenix nickered softly and pressed his massive head against Jake's chest, a gesture of trust and affection that spoke louder than words. Whatever came next, they would face it together. In the distance, Jake could see a dust cloud approaching on the main road, 3 vehicles moving fast toward the clinic. Theodore Blackwood was coming to claim his stolen property, unaware that he was driving straight into a trap that would finally bring his criminal enterprise to an end. The final confrontation was about to begin. Blackwood arrived with the burning torch at dawn, 3 hours earlier than expected, catching everyone off guard except Phoenix, whose restless pacing in his stall had warned Jake that something was wrong. The stallion's ears were pinned back, his nostrils flaring with the scent of danger that preceded his former captor like smoke before fire. "He's here early," Jake muttered, watching through the clinic window as Blackwood's convoy pulled up 2 trucks and a horse trailer, with 4 men who moved with the practiced efficiency of a military unit. Agent Reeves cursed under her breath, speaking rapidly into her radio to coordinate her scattered agents. They were supposed to arrive at noon. "My people aren't in position yet." Blackwood stepped out of the lead truck, carrying what looked like a crude torch, a length of pipe wrapped with gasoline-soaked rags, already lit and casting dancing shadows in the pre-dawn darkness. His face was twisted with the kind of rage that came from a man who'd built his life on intimidation and found himself finally challenged. "Morrison!" Blackwood's voice carried across the clinic grounds like a war cry. "I know you're in there, and I know what you think you've discovered. But that horse belongs to me, and I'm taking him home today one way or another." Jake's blood ran cold as he realized Blackwood's intentions. The torch wasn't just for intimidation, it was meant to recreate the circumstances of Phoenix's original rescue, using fire as a weapon to force the Stallion's surrender. "He's planning to set the clinic on fire," Jake told Agent Reeves, his voice tight with alarm. "Phoenix will panic, and in the confusion, Blackwood can claim he's rescuing the horse from another wildfire." Agent Reeves was already moving, speaking into her radio with the crisp authority of someone coordinating a federal operation. "All units converge on the clinic immediately. Suspect is armed with an incendiary device and threatening federal evidence." The Blackwood's men were spreading out around the clinic, and Jake could see they were carrying more than just the usual ranch hand equipment. These weren't cowboys. They were professional criminals, and they'd come prepared for a fight. Phoenix's distressed whinnying echoed from the back of the clinic, the sound cutting through Jake's heart like a blade. The Stallion was reliving his worst nightmare, trapped again by fire and the man who'd stolen 3 years of his life. "I have to get to Phoenix," Jake said, reaching for his father's Winchester. "Wait for backup," Agent Reeves commanded. "We've got agents en route." Her words were cut off by the crash of breaking glass as one of Blackwood's men threw a rock through the clinic's front window. The torch followed immediately after, landing on Doc Miller's desk and setting fire to a stack of medical papers. Jake didn't wait for permission. Phoenix needed him, and nothing else mattered. He burst through the clinic's back door just as Blackwood was approaching Phoenix's stall, the torch held high like a weapon. The Stallion was pressed against the far wall of his enclosure, his eyes rolling white with terror. But when he saw Jake, something changed in his posture, hope replacing despair. "Stay back, Morrison," Blackwood snarled, waving the torch in Jake's direction. "This horse is coming with me, and anyone who tries to stop me is going to get burned." "The only thing getting burned here is your criminal operation," Jake replied, raising the Winchester to his shoulder. "FBI agents are surrounding this place, and they know all about your stolen horse ring." Blackwood's laugh was ugly and cold. "FBI agents? You mean the 3 people hiding behind that truck over there? I've got twice as many men, and mine aren't worried about following federal regulations." As if to prove his point, gunfire erupted from the front of the clinic, where Blackwood's men had engaged the outnumbered FBI agents. Agent Reeves' voice crackled over her radio, calling for immediate backup. But Jake knew help might arrive too late. Phoenix reared up in his stall, striking at the air with hooves that could crush bone, his terror giving way to the fierce protectiveness Jake had seen during their training sessions. The Stallion was preparing to fight, even trapped in his enclosure, and Jake realized that Blackwood had made a fatal miscalculation. "You remember me, don't you, boy?" Blackwood said, approaching the stall with the torch extended. "Remember who owns you? Remember what happens to horses that don't obey?" That's when Tommy Henderson appeared from behind the clinic, moving with the quick stealth of a 12-year-old who'd spent his summer exploring every inch of the property. The boy had somehow circled around Blackwood's perimeter, and he was carrying something that made Jake's heart stop. A gasoline can from Doc Miller's generator, sloshing with fuel. "Tommy, no," Jake shouted, but the boy was already in motion. Tommy threw the gasoline directly at Blackwood's torch, creating a whoosh of flames that forced the rancher to drop his weapon and dive for cover. In the same moment, Jake kicked open Phoenix's stall door, and the Stallion burst out like a black thunderbolt. Phoenix didn't run for safety. Instead, he wheeled around to face Blackwood, his ears pinned back and his teeth bared in a display of equine fury that was magnificent and terrifying to behold. This was no longer a victim. This was a warrior protecting his chosen family. Blackwood scrambled backward, his expensive clothes singed and his face showing the first crack in his composed facade. "Control that animal." "I'm not controlling anything," Jake said, keeping the Winchester trained on Blackwood, while Phoenix positioned himself between Jake and danger. "He's making his own choices, just like he did the day I pulled him out of that fire." The sound of approaching sirens mixed with continued gunfire from the front of the clinic, creating a symphony of chaos that seemed to energize Phoenix rather than frighten him. The stallion was no longer the terrified animal trapped by flames. He was home, defending his territory and his chosen family. Blackwood's remaining men appeared around the corner of the clinic, weapons drawn, but they stopped short when they saw Phoenix. The stallion was a magnificent sight in the early morning light, his black coat gleaming like armor, his powerful body coiled with barely contained energy. "Shoot the horse," Blackwood ordered, his voice cracking with desperation. "Boss, that animal's worth $50,000, one of his men protested. "It's worthless if it can testify against us. Shoot it." But before anyone could act, Tommy Henderson demonstrated why 12-year-old boys should never be underestimated in a crisis. The kid had grabbed a garden hose from behind the clinic and was spraying everyone indiscriminately, creating enough chaos and confusion to give Jake the opening he needed. Jake dove to the side, using Phoenix's massive body as cover while he worked the Winchester's bolt action. The rifle spoke once, sending Blackwood's men scrambling for cover behind their vehicles. Phoenix, meanwhile, had decided he'd had enough of being threatened. The stallion charged toward Blackwood with the focused intensity of a guided missile, his hooves throwing up chunks of dirt and his eyes fixed on the man who'd stolen 3 years of his life. Blackwood turned to run, but Phoenix was faster. The stallion caught up with him in 3 strides, rearing up on his hind legs and bringing his front hooves down inches from Blackwood's head, close enough to make the point, but controlled enough to avoid actually crushing the man. It was a display of intelligence and restraint that took Jake's breath away. Phoenix could have killed Blackwood easily, but he chose intimidation over murder, proving once again that horses were often more civilized than the humans who claimed to own them. Maria Santos stepped out of the FBI vehicle with the grace of someone who'd spent her life around horses, carrying a manila folder that would change everything. The original registration papers were yellowed with age, but still official, bearing Phoenix's true name and bloodline in her careful handwriting. From 4 years ago. "Storm," she called softly, and Phoenix's head whipped around at the sound of his original name spoken in the voice of someone who'd loved him before Jake even knew he existed. The stallion stood perfectly still, his ears pricked forward, processing this ghost from his past. Then, with the deliberate steps of someone making a choice, he walked toward Maria while keeping one eye on Jake, as if asking permission to greet an old friend. "Hello, my beautiful boy," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face as Phoenix lowered his massive head to nuzzle her shoulder. "I never stopped looking for you. Not for one day." Jake watched this reunion with emotions too complex to name. Joy that Phoenix Storm had been restored to someone who clearly loved him, grief at the approaching end of their own relationship, and something deeper, a recognition that some stories were bigger than any individual's claim to happiness. Agent Reeves emerged from behind the FBI vehicles where Blackwood and his men were being processed, her professional satisfaction evident as she approached the group. "Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for interstate horse theft, fraud, racketeering, and about 15 other federal charges that should keep you busy for the next 20 years. Blackwood's rage had collapsed into defeat, his expensive clothes torn and his face smudged with dirt from his encounter with Phoenix's hooves. That horse was legally purchased, with forged papers from a criminal organization we've been tracking for 3 years. Agent Reeves interrupted. Mrs. Santos has the original registration documents, and the hidden brand on Storm's coat matches her ranch records perfectly. As the FBI agents led Blackwood away, Jake found himself standing next to Maria, both of them watching Phoenix graze peacefully in the clinic's paddock as if the morning's violence had never happened. "He's magnificent," Maria said quietly. "Even more beautiful than I remembered. You've taken wonderful care of him." "He saved my life more than I saved his," Jake replied. "After losing my ranch, my wife, everything that mattered, Phoenix gave me a reason to get up in the morning." Maria studied Jake's face, reading the love and loss written there. "Carlos used to say that horses don't belong to people, people belong to horses. Storm chose you the day you pulled him from that fire, just like he chose Carlos the day we brought him home as a yearling." She opened the manila folder and pulled out a document that made Jake's breath catch. A bill of sale, already signed and notarized, transferring ownership of Clearwater's Storm from Maria Santos to Jake Morrison for the sum of $1. "I can't accept this," Jake protested. "He's your horse, your connection to your husband." "He was Carlos's horse," Maria corrected gently. "And Carlos always said the most important thing about loving something was knowing when to let it go. Storm has found where he belongs, and that's with you." Phoenix chose that moment to approach them, moving with the fluid grace that had first captivated Jake during their training sessions. The stallion positioned himself between Jake and Maria, as if bridging the gap between his past and his future. "Besides," Maria continued, scratching behind Phoenix's ears, "I run a breeding ranch, and Storm here is worth his weight in gold as a foundation sire. I'd like to propose a partnership. You keep Storm, train him, love him the way you obviously do. I'll send Marays to be bred, and we'll split the profits 50-50. Jake stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You're offering me a chance to get back into the horse business?" "I'm offering you a chance to do what you were born to do," Maria replied. "Storm's bloodlines are impeccable, and from what I've seen today, your training skills are extraordinary. Together, we could build something special." Doc Miller approached them, his veterinary bag in one hand and a grin on his weathered face. "Did I hear someone mention a horse breeding partnership? Because I've got a clinic that could use the business, and Jake Morrison is the best horse trainer this county's seen in 20 years. Tommy Henderson bounced up to them, still covered in dirt from his heroic garden hose assault on Blackwood's men. "Does this mean Phoenix gets to stay? And can I still help take care of him?" Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him. Maria's generous offer, Doc Miller's professional support, Tommy's eager enthusiasm, and Phoenix's trusting gaze. For the first time since losing his ranch, he could see a future that held something besides mere survival. "I think," Jake said slowly, "that sounds like the beginning of something wonderful." Phoenix nickered his approval and nudged Jake's shoulder, with his nose sealing the agreement in the language they'd learned to share. The morning sun was climbing higher, burning away the last shadows of the confrontation and illuminating the start of a new chapter in all their lives. As the FBI vehicles disappeared down the road with their prisoners, and the crowd of townspeople began to disperse with excited chatter about the morning's events, Jake remained in the paddock with Phoenix. The stallion stood beside him, solid and warm and real, a living reminder that sometimes the most important rescues worked both ways. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the paddock fence, her face glowing with satisfaction. "I told you that horse chose." "You, Jake Morrison. Looks like he chose well." Jake smiled, his hand resting on Phoenix's neck where he could feel the strong, steady heartbeat of an animal who'd survived fire and theft and abuse to find his way home. "Yes, ma'am. I believe he did." The new ranch sign caught the morning light like a promise fulfilled, its hand-carved letters spelling out Morrison Santos Horse Training in the same style Jake's grandfather had used for the original Morrison spread. 6 months after the confrontation with Blackwood, Jake stood beside Phoenix in the largest paddock, watching a young colt take his first tentative steps under the watchful eye of his mother. Phoenix had sired 3 foals already, with 2 more mares due to deliver before spring. Each birth brought Jake closer to financial stability and further from the dark months when he questioned whether life held any purpose beyond mere endurance. The partnership with Maria Santos had exceeded both their expectations, drawing clients from across the mountain states who wanted their horses trained by the man who'd risked his life to save a stallion from wildfire. "He's gonna be a beauty," Tommy Henderson observed, perched on the fence rail with the confidence of someone who'd appointed himself assistant trainer. At 13, the boy had developed an intuitive understanding of horse behavior that reminded Jake of his own youth, when every day brought new lessons about trust and communication across species lines. Phoenix nickered softly and moved toward the mare and foal, his role as herd protector coming as naturally as breathing. The stallion's presence calmed the nervous mother, and Jake marveled again at the intelligence that had first drawn him to this magnificent animal. Mrs. Henderson approached the paddock carrying her usual offering of coffee and homemade biscuits, her boarding house now thriving with the steady stream of visitors who came to see the famous rescue horse and his trainer. She'd added 2 more rooms to accommodate the demand, and her investment in Jake Morrison had paid dividends she'd never expected. "Maria called this morning," she announced, handing Jake his coffee and a new cup, not the empty vessel that had once symbolized his despair, but a cheerful blue mug with "World's Best Horse Trainer" painted on the side. "She's sending 2 more mares next month, and she wants to discuss expanding the breeding program." Jake sipped his coffee and watched Phoenix work with the new foal, teaching the youngster about boundaries and respect through gentle but firm corrections. The stallion's patience with the baby horses never ceased to amaze him, as if Phoenix understood that his role extended beyond merely suring offspring to actually raising them. "Any word from the FBI about Blackwood's trial?" Tommy asked. "Agent Reeves says he's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison," Jake replied. "Turns out our Phoenix was just the tip of the iceberg. They found evidence linking Blackwood's operation to horse thefts across 8 states. The justice felt appropriate, but Jake found he rarely thought about Theodore Blackwood anymore. The man had been a shadow from Phoenix's past, and like all shadows, he disappeared when exposed to bright light. What mattered now was the future. They were building together man and horse, trainer and stallion, partners in an enterprise that honored the best qualities of both species. Doc Miller's truck appeared on the horizon, raising dust as it approached the ranch. The old veterinarian made his rounds 3 times a week now, monitoring the health of the growing herd and offering advice that came from 50 years of working with horses. His partnership with Jake had given his practice new life, and his expertise with breeding operations had proved invaluable. "Afternoon, Jake," Doc Miller called as he climbed out of his truck. "How's our prize stallion today?" "Same as always, showing off for the mares and making sure everyone knows he's in charge." Phoenix demonstrated this by approaching the fence. With the dignified stride of someone accustomed to admiration, the stallion had regained all his weight, and then some, his black coat gleaming with health and his eyes bright with contentment. The scars from his burns had faded to thin white lines that told the story of his survival without detracting from his beauty. "Maria wants to enter him in the Denver National Stock Show next spring," Doc Miller mentioned casually. "Says he's got the bloodlines and the temperament to be a champion, and the publicity wouldn't hurt the breeding program." Jake considered this, running his hand along Phoenix's neck while the stallion pressed against him in their familiar gesture of affection. The thought of putting Phoenix on display felt strange after so many months of private partnership, but he understood the business value of recognition. "What do you think, boy?" Jake asked Phoenix directly. ready to show the world what you can do. Phoenix's response was to rear up on his hind legs in a display of power and grace that would have looked right at home in any show ring. The stallion had never lost his theatrical tendencies, and Jake suspected he'd enjoy the attention of competition. As the afternoon sun painted the paddocks gold, Jake found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The empty coffee cup that had once symbolized his despair now held flowers on Mrs. Henderson's kitchen table. Sarah's medical kit had been replaced by professional veterinary supplies, but her memory lived on in every gentle touch Jake used with injured animals. His father's silver horseshoe remained in Jake's pocket, a reminder that luck was indeed preparation meeting opportunity. Tommy had grown 3 inches and developed a kind of quiet confidence that came from being trusted with real responsibility. Mrs. Henderson had become the unofficial grandmother to every foal born on the ranch, spoiling them with attention and apples from her kitchen garden. Doc Miller had found renewed purpose in helping build something lasting rather than just maintaining what already existed. And Phoenix Magnificent, intelligent, loyal Phoenix, had become the foundation not just of a breeding program, but of a life rebuilt from ashes. The stallion who'd been saved from fire had saved his rescuer in return, proving that the most important bonds transcended ownership papers and legal definitions. As evening approached, Jake led Phoenix back to his stall, not because the stallion needed to be confined, but because it was part of their daily routine, a time for quiet conversation and mutual grooming that strengthened their partnership. Phoenix followed willingly, his trust in Jake as complete as Jake's devotion to him. "Tomorrow we start training that new colt," Jake told Phoenix as he brushed the stallion's coat with long, rhythmic strokes. "Maria thinks he's got championship potential, and I believe she's right. He's got your intelligence and his mother's temperament." Phoenix listened with the attention he always gave to Jake's voice, his ears swiveling to catch every word. Sometimes Jake wondered if the stallion actually understood human speech, or if their communication had simply evolved beyond the need for language. Outside the stable, the lights of Clearwater Creek twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the the community that had rallied around them during their darkest hour. The town had prospered along with the ranch, drawing visitors and investment that had revitalized businesses and brought new life to old dreams. Jake finished grooming Phoenix and stepped back to admire his work. The stallion stood quietly, his dark eyes reflecting contentment and security. No longer the terrified animal trapped by flames, but a confident patriarch surrounded by family. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, the words carrying the weight of everything Phoenix had given him: purpose, hope, and the chance to become again the man he'd always been meant to be. Phoenix nickered softly and touched Jake's shoulder with his muzzle, their nightly ritual of affection that spoke louder than words. In that touch was forgiveness for the past, gratitude for the present, and faith in whatever tomorrow might bring. As Jake walked back toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, soon to be replaced by his own cabin on the ranch property, he could hear Phoenix settling in for the night, the soft sounds of a contented horse in familiar surroundings. The September air carried the scent of hay and horses, autumn grass and wood smoke from distant chimneys. It was the smell of home, hard-won and deeply appreciated. The smell of second chances and new beginnings, of love that transcended species, and bonds that grew stronger with each passing day. Jake Morrison had saved a stallion from wildfire, but Phoenix had saved Jake from something far more dangerous: the despair that comes from believing your best days are behind you. Together, they built something worth having, something worth protecting, something that would outlast them both. And in the quiet of that September evening, with Phoenix safe in his stall and the future spread out before them like an uncharted trail, Jake allowed himself to believe that sometimes, when you're prepared to seize the opportunity, even the most broken lives can be made whole again.